I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 97th edition of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. We're going to be talking about a different kind of intelligence this week, emotional intelligence, not the cognitive, logical, rational, doing the quadratic formula in your head or memorizing the 127th decimal of pi type intelligence, but instead the sort of intelligence that allows people to like you, and maybe even more importantly, it allows you to enjoy your own company. We're going to be talking with a Smart Drug Smarts alumnus, Professor Stough from Swinburne University, who we spoke with probably over a year ago now about the adaptogen plants. He is, like so many other people within neuroscience, a man of wide interests, and as well as studying the particulars of plant-based nootropic compounds, has also been really instrumental in putting together measurement systems for emotional intelligence. And we're going to be talking with him about that during the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I will tell you where you can find a quick online emotional intelligence test, not the full 8-hour barrage of information that Dr. Stough discusses during his interview, but something quite a bit more bite-sized, but still pretty interesting. I took the test myself and did not do as well as I thought I might on it. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But to kick things off, let's get started with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it has long been suspected, and in the last couple of decades has been backed up by science, that a significant portion of a person's intelligence is genetically determined. Various studies seem to indicate that this amount is somewhere around 50%. 50% of a person's final IQ is a result of the interplay of genetic factors. But which genes are actually involved is a far more difficult question to answer, because it's no small number of genes that are dictating how a person's brain winds up being built. Instead, it is thousands upon thousands of genes, each of which individually might have only a very small contributing role. So there is no smart gene, no dumb gene, nothing quite so simple. And yet that doesn't stop scientists from being curious about just what genes might have an impact on a person's final intelligence. So in these situations where you want to tease something significant out of data, but you think that the effect size is going to be very small, one's only recourse as a scientist is to have a very, very large amount of sample data, where if you find a small effect, you can still be confident enough that it's not just background noise that's showing up and leading to a false conclusion that something's going on where actually it's not. Luckily, there has recently been a study of over 126,000 people whose educational outcomes and their genotypes have been cross-referenced. In this study, they were using educational attainment as a proxy phenotype for cognitive performance. Cognitive performance is a bit of a fuzzy, hard to get your handle on, hard to quantify attribute. Obviously, we'd all like to be cognitively performing well, but being able to point to a particular metric for that is not always the easiest thing in the world. So this study is making the assumption that how far a person got educationally as far as the final degree they attained, the grades they got in the completion of that final degree, those things are a close enough correlate to a person's cognitive performance that can be used as a proxy phenotype to see how cognitive performance stacks up against these different genetic variants. And in research published last year, 2014, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they did number crunching on these very, very large studies and were able to identify, so far, 3 genetic variants which seem to have a significant impact on a person's final intelligence. Now again, this is statistical significance, not jumping up and down, oh my gosh, this is such a big deal significance. In fact, if somebody has all 3 of these genetic variants dialed in optimally for their intelligence, so with each genetic variant, you've got 2 alleles, so you've got a total of 6 of these switches that could be on or off. And if all 6 of them are on, that would give you a whopping 1.8 extra IQ points versus somebody that did not have any of these positive variants. So each identified variant was good for only 0.3 IQ points. The researchers expect that there are many such genes that will have small but measurable effects, but in order to get these genes to identify themselves clearly, further studies with even larger sample sizes will probably be needed.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
I'd like to give a big hearty thank you to everybody that left a positive review for Smart Drug Smarts on iTunes, on Stitcher, on the wall above your favorite urinal. Pretty much any sort of public venue is always super appreciated. On iTunes this past week, we picked up 2 5-star reviews. Safjaff said, all the best info about smart drugs. And Chris Quamina said, a tremendous amount of information is shared in every episode. Information which is often both interesting and practical at the same time. Awesome work, guys. Thank you so very much. This was a very communication-rich week this week. I actually made it back down to the bottom of my inbox, which was nice. We had people writing in about their experiences with Adderall, with holotropic breathwork, with vitamin D3, with mitogen and Nexus from Axon Labs, with all kinds of stuff. I haven't actually responded to everything yet, but I've at least read it, which is a step in the right direction. If you want to reach out, we've got the contact page at smartdrugsmarts.com and my very easy-to-remember email address. That is jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. Jesse. There are no I's in the boys' spelling of Jesse. It's only I if you're short for Jessica, which I am not. Speaking of emails and spelling, if you're looking for an email featuring fabulous spelling, then please visit smartdrugsmarts.com and sign up for our mailing list. If you can catch a misspelling in one of our emails, I will send you a coupon for a free bottle of Nexus or mitogen from Axon Labs. That's how confident I am that we've got a grammatically and punctuationally and verbally resplendent email newsletter. You can sign up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. One quick follow-up from last week's episode with Dr. Claire Stanford talking about noradrenaline. She had mentioned an asthma treatment drug that blocked noradrenaline receptors in the bronchi of the lungs. That was not right. The drug actually activates receptors. She wanted to set that one right for the record, so here we are doing so. Please update your memory banks as appropriate. Also had a couple of people reach out over the course of this week asking, are we going to do another water fast? If you've been listening for a while, you know that during February of this year, 2015, myself and a double handful of other Smart Drug Smarts listeners did a week-long water-only fast. For reasons that I will not go into now, you've probably heard the story before, but the answer is yes, I will be doing it again. We'll probably be doing it at the same time, February of next year. Believe me, as interesting as it is, it's not the kind of thing that you want to probably do more than once a year, or if you're like most people, never is quite enough. But if you want to plan ahead for that, put February on your calendar, drop an email if you want to participate in a small group of us that'll be sort of commiserating online when we go through that process in 2016. We also, by the time you hear this episode, we should have something finished off that we've been working on the Smart Drug Smarts website, which is kind of cool. So I mentioned a while ago that I started an Instagram account for Smart Drug Smarts, and I've been posting to it with decent regularity every couple of days. Some days I'll do a few, some days I won't do any. But now that we got this page that I'm about to tell you about, I'm going to try to make it more of a regular thing. So we've got this page on smartdrugsmarts.com/Jesse's-stack that we've wired up to the Instagram account so that when I take a photo of some of the supplements that I'm taking, which I sometimes do, and then I put hashtags on those supplements, our Smart Drug Smarts page sniffs that out of Instagram and pulls that into a timeline, which will wind up showing what supplements I'm taking on what days. I haven't been doing this religiously, so it's not really a thorough documentation yet, but within the next couple of weeks it will be. It's going to show a 2-week history of the supplements that I've been taking on a day-to-day basis, along with the relevant photos out of Instagram. So kind of a combination of quantified self-documentation and a little bit of visual razzmatazz, some selfies and cats and things like that thrown in. And you'll no doubt see provocatively posed jars of Nexus and mitogen in various exotic locations. But again, this cool new Instagram-infused page is at smartdrugsmarts.com/Jesse's-stack.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we are about to be speaking with Professor Stough, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and psychology at Swinburne University of Technology in Australia. He's also the director of the Swinburne Center for Human Psychopharmacology. And the first time that we spoke with him, it was with his psychopharmacology hat on. Today, it's going to be more around emotional intelligence. We'll be talking somewhat about the GENOS model of emotional intelligence, which, true to form, I mispronounce as GENOS during the interview, but it's actually a soft O sound, GENOS. And if you want some more terminology, you'll hear a couple times during the interview EI versus CI. As you might guess, that's emotional intelligence versus cognitive intelligence. So now you can drop some more acronyms and impress your friends on the playground. And emotional intelligence, if you haven't heard the term already, should probably preamble this a bit by saying that it's not one thing. It should really be thought of more as the emotional intelligences. And one of Professor Stough's main roles, as he'll talk about, was defining some of the individual subcomponents of the overall emotional intelligence umbrella. As social animals, it probably goes without saying how important this type of intelligence is, and why, even though this has been the realm of everybody from philosophers to mother-in-laws forever, it's worth really looking at rigorously and academically. So with no further ado, Professor Stough. There was a book in the early 1990s, if I remember correctly, called Emotional Intelligence. Was that kind of what kicked things off?
Yeah, certainly. That book you're talking about was written by Daniel Goleman, who has a PhD in psychology, but he is really a sort of a popularist The book was really well written, I think very engaging. And he brought attention sort of to the wider community about what is emotional intelligence and theoretically why it's important with some amazing examples. But he certainly didn't coin the term emotional intelligence, and he was really referring to a lot of the work of two American psychologists called Salovey and Mayer, who came out of some of the Ivy League universities in the US. And they first started publishing on emotional intelligence in, I think, 1990 was the first one in paper in Emotions. Also a fairly important article in the journal Intelligence in the following year. After that, they sort of set the sort of theoretical model for a construct called emotional intelligence, and then people have really sort of started to fill in the gaps after that.
What was the landscape like before these studies started? What is it that was lacking that led to the academic exploration here?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to people like Aristotle, doesn't it? People said the intelligent use of emotions. So I think there was a very strong scientific view that we're much more rational beings than we are. I think the whole sort of area of effective neuroscience, which started to become sort of big in the 80s and 90s, where we started to look at the sort of neuroscience of emotions, sort of set the scene for it a little bit. But I think, there was in the 50s and 60s, there was particularly the view that our emotions shouldn't really sully our cognitions or our thoughts. We should keep our emotions under check. And I think, we missed sort of an opportunity to try to develop a construct where emotions and cognition and thoughts, our consciousness are sort of in the same room, if you like, and understand how they interplay together, how we can use our cognitive capacity to help us manage emotions, for instance, and also what important information do emotions tell us. And, that's even before our interactions with other people. So, I think the Salovey and Mayer model and construct really allowed people then to scientifically study it under a bona fide psychological construct rather than just cognition by itself or emotions by itself. Certainly the sort of society that I was part of really comes from sort of IQ background, Society for Intelligence Research. Not very often talked about emotions. It's really about our sort of cognitive capacity. So there's always been that bias, I think, against bringing those two constructs together. So when Salovey and Mayer first proposed it, a lot of people thought, wow, this is, what we've thought, noticed for a long time, but now we've got a scientific construct we can start to research and apply even as well.
Maybe could you talk a little about what we know about the physical morphology of the brain and how that affects maybe some of the different areas that work with emotional intelligence versus more of a logical, straightforward cognition?
Look, I think our emotional parts of the brain are much older than our more conscious intellectual parts of the brain. And so, as we evolved higher level consciousness and our ability to be more rational and use reasoning and those sorts of things, which have given us this incredible advantage, that sort of got overlaid over existing parts of the brain and particularly sort of the emotional parts of the brain. And emotions have been incredibly valuable in terms of our survival. Emotions tell us when there's danger, when there's information from people that we meet that could be dangerous or important to us. Also, how we lay down long-term memories, for instance, are very much attached to emotional valence as well. And this idea of sort of intuition and learning from our mistakes is a big component of that, is about emotions as well. So, and these emotions, particularly the sort of negative emotions, are sort of more generated in subcortical areas. So, so I think, we developed this cognitive part of the brain to understand emotions and to help regulate emotions and to use emotions in a sort of an intelligent way. So I think as we evolved this prefrontal cortex over top of the sort of limbic system structures. So it doesn't mean that, they work independently. I think they work very closely together.
Is there any reason to suspect that the human set of emotions has changed from other animals to which we're closely related, that, the monkeys, for example?
Well, look, there's sort of a very small set of emotions which people refer to as primary emotions. And I think many higher order animals also experience those. So, their anxiety and fear and anger and those sort of things. But they're a very small set of emotions. Actually, the larger array of emotions are what we call secondary emotions. And these are emotions that are basically constructed by different cultures. So not all cultures will experience the same set of emotions. And clearly, animals don't have access probably to those types of emotions. I'm not really an expert on animal emotions, but maybe they also construct some emotions that we don't experience. Somebody who's very emotionally intelligent has sort of a very wide array of different emotions. So if you, for instance, picked up the dictionary and just picked out words that were emotions, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And, the question is, how often would you experience any of those emotions? Or some people don't even know what some of those emotions are, for instance.
So tell us a little about the Genos Emotional Intelligence model that you were one of the founders of.
So, a lot of our early research was with organizations. And back after Daniel Goleman released his book in 1995, it really became very, very popular in the workplace. And so we came to look at this area in the late 90s. And, some of the questions we had was, is it a construct? If it is a valid scientific construct, how would you measure the different dimensions of emotional intelligence? And so one of the sort of big research studies that we did is we sort of took all known tests of emotional intelligence at that time and then administered it to about 500 people. It was about like 8 hours of testing per person. So, we sort of burnt a few friendships over that study. It resulted in a huge amount of data. And then we used some statistical techniques, which psychologists refer to as factor analysis, to understand the underlying factors across all those different tests. So, we had the Salovey and Mayer tests, and we had some self-report tests, and we had a range of different tests. And at that stage, it sort of came out that we could sort of reliably measure about 7 different dimensions around the sort of cognitive, emotional interaction. And those 7 dimensions really mapped onto what Salovey and Mayer really posited as a theory of emotional intelligence, that there could be individual differences in things like emotional self-awareness, our ability to express emotions effectively, our ability to understand the emotions of others, our ability to make decisions based on how we felt about certain situations or emotions, and basically also how we managed and controlled emotions and how we were able to transit different emotions from moment to moment. So we were sort of pushed by organisations at that time in Australia to help them measure and develop emotional intelligence. And so we came up with this sort of pragmatic test of emotional intelligence, which literally hundreds of thousands of people have done now in Australia, but also sort of around the world in organisations. And then the university set up a little startup company, and Ben Palmer, who was doing a PhD on this topic, eventually sort of became the CEO of that business. And they've been working with organisations to develop leadership and to develop emotional intelligence using that model ever since.
So there are 7 sort of independent axes of emotional intelligence under this model?
Yeah, so they're not totally independent, but they are sort of relatively independent. So they come out as separate factors. You can be competent in one or all of those dimensions, or none actually, or you can be, you score very low on some of those dimensions. And all those dimensions follow what we call a normal distribution, or the bell curve. And you can then develop standardized scores and normative data, and then you can develop sort of reports based on those scores. And then, we did a whole lot of research looking at what those scores predicted. And we found that some of the dimensions related to well-being, and some of those dimensions were very strong predictors of effective leadership, which we call transformational leadership, as sort of those leaders who are interested in the people that they're leading and can develop those people and mentor those people effectively. They tended to have very high emotional intelligence. We also found that emotional intelligence predicted workplace performance, and it's just sort of predicted theoretically related constructs within organizations.
That's an interesting question. As far as workplace performance and these metrics of success that we have in society, how does emotional intelligence stack up against logical cognitive intelligence as far as predictors of success?
Yeah, so there's a really good YouTube video of actually Daniel Goleman talking about this, and I think he's hits it on the head a little bit. He argues essentially that your IQ or your cognitive intelligence may help you get the job in the first place, but after that, how well you do in the organization, whether you can sort of move up in the organization, is really about your emotional intelligence. And he argues that if you come into, say, an entry-level accounting job and there are 50 people who come in at the same level, you're going to be pretty similar in terms of your IQ. And so the differentiator after that is probably going to be about how you're able to manage stress and how you're able to work in a team and to relate to other people. So your emotional intelligence might become a more important predictor after that.
And one of the things that obviously sort of the million-dollar question in cognitive intelligence is how can it be improved? Are there ways of improving things like fluid intelligence? How are we with emotional intelligence? If you're not where you want to be on one of these bell-shaped curves of the emotional intelligence subcomponents, is there anything you can do to move yourself around?
My view and the data sets that I've seen on papers strongly suggest that emotional intelligence is much more malleable than cognitive intelligence. I think there's great hope for cognitive training, helping your sort of fluid intelligence as you get older. But certainly emotional intelligence seems to be very malleable. So, if you take a step back and think about what are the dimensions, what are the competencies of emotional intelligence? Well, how do we manage negative emotions? How do we transit emotions like anxiety and anger and frustration? Well, psychologists have been using cognitive behavioral therapy and other techniques to do that for a long time. So there are many strategies that you can employ to help people better manage their emotions and feel less negative emotions and more positive emotions. There are strategies in which you can help people understand emotions better. There are strategies you can use to help people have better listening skills and develop more empathy for people. When we're doing a lot of this work with organizations, which I have to say I found a little bit unrewarding at some level. Organizations would often say to us, well, we don't mind spending time and effort and money developing our staff's emotional intelligence because we really think it's important. But, shouldn't this be done in schools and at the university level? And that really made us sort of think about when is the best time to develop somebody's emotional intelligence. And also at that time, schools started to become really interested in, social and emotional intelligence and well-being. And a lot of schools were thinking, well, maybe cognitive performance is not the only thing that we should be developing at school. So we were starting to get a lot of inquiries from schools about how we could measure and develop emotional intelligence in schools as well.
Let me ask a terminology question. What makes emotional intelligence versus social skills? I mean, are these an inherent part of our brain structure, or are these all socially learned behaviors?
I think they're a bit of both. I think emotions are very fundamental and basic as part of our brain function. But that's, I think, where the frontal areas of the brain are important in terms of us learning about emotions and the significance of emotions and how to manage those emotions as well. So, for instance, our research with CEOs and high-level executives in Australia, we tested about 500 of them, and we measured their emotional intelligence and their leadership mobility. And we found really high relationships between some of the dimensions like their ability to understand the emotions of others and their ability to manage the emotions of other people and effective leadership. So certainly leadership is a very higher order behavior, but you have to have the lower order competencies that lead to those behaviors. And so I think emotional intelligence is sort of the building blocks of a lot of important social behaviors.
Are the people that are on the upper end of that bell-shaped curve, maybe a couple sigmas out in one of these special areas, are they born with a special aptitude? Is there something biological that is innate that's helping them, or is it just that they've done a better job learning a skill or had better access to a learning environment where they could pick up that skill?
I think the answer to that is that we don't really know. But if I had to hypothesize, I think a lot of it's about the environment that different children grow up in and their sort of interactions with parents and others, their sort of stimulating environments. So I have a lot of colleagues who hypothesize that there's a strong genetic basis for all behaviors, but I think it's really some sort of genetic environment interaction where the environment is incredibly important.
I'm just looking at the genosinternational.com listing of these 7 core emotional intelligences. There's self-awareness, awareness of others, expression, reasoning, self-management, the management of others, and finally self-control. Of those, were there one or maybe a handful that seemed to be most predictive of things like workplace success or personal well-being?
Sure. Yeah. Really fundamental ones are, I think, emotional self-awareness. So if you're not very aware of the emotions that you're experiencing, but not just the emotions you're experiencing, but why you're experiencing those emotions and how those emotions affect your behavior, then that's a very, really limiting sort of deficit to have in an organization. One of the most important ones in terms of organizational success that we often see is understanding others. So that's a really key determinant in terms of developing relationships with other people and also developing trust, being interested in other people and being able to read the emotions that other people display is a really important part of having a relationship with another person, and relationships are so important in organizations. And then you move to being able to manage emotions. Being able to manage emotions really means about trying to being able to feel the right emotion at the right time and not to experience negative emotions all the time. So negative emotions are things like anxiety and anger and frustration, but there are literally hundreds of negative emotions. And people who are suffering some level of depression are people who are experiencing negative emotions too much and too often and have an inability to transit those emotions into more positive emotions. So well-being is definitely about being able to experience positive emotions. And so that's really important in the workplace as well. But the dimension that we often find being important is the ability to help others manage their emotions. So as a leader, for instance, the ability to say things and do things that allow the people that you're leading to think of the world slightly differently, to motivate them, for them to experience positive emotions. So, for instance, I have quite a few PhD students here, and some of them love being a PhD student. It's a great life, but sometimes they stay as a PhD student for too long. And so my job at some stage is to help them transit some positive emotions into more negative emotions where they maybe realize that it's not great for their careers to be a PhD student forever, that sort of thing.
Let's say you've taken one of these tests, you know sort of where you fall on these different spectrums. What steps might a person take for self-improvement?
Well, I guess the first step is really to look at your scores. So a self-report test really tells you a little bit about how you see yourself. That can be useful and can give you a score in terms of percentiles from 1 to 99 in terms of how you see yourself compared to other people in the population in terms of workplace behaviours. So the GENOS scale has been designed to measure sort of emotional intelligence in the workplace mainly. So it's a little bit unique in that sense. So there's the self-report, but then we also have another version of that, which we call a 360-degree report, where you get other people who know you to rate you on your behaviours that are related to emotional intelligence. And so then if you do the 360-degree report, then you've got information about how you see yourself, but also about how other people see you. And so then you might get some help in terms of understanding the report by somebody. You'd probably focus on one or two of the dimensions that are lower than you might like, and that might be theoretically related to your job or where you want to go with your job. For instance, if you wanted to become a leader, then it would be important that you showed behaviors that were related to understanding others and managing others. And then people who consult based on the model, they also run development programs which specifically target the different dimensions and tricks they use to help people show more behaviors that are emotionally intelligent. But we don't at the university really do much work in that area any longer. We've now sort of transited organizations, if you like, to work with schools now pretty well exclusively. And as such, a lot of the work we've done over the last 5 to 8 years has been really tailored around the needs of schools. So we really had to develop a whole new way of looking at it, because obviously younger people's brains, if you like, develop at different rates and are not as well developed as adults. And we started off looking at developing new measures of emotional intelligence. So we developed a test for adolescents, and then more recently we've developed a measure for primary school kids. So we can measure some of the dimensions of EI in schools and track kids over time. And then we started doing some research on what do those scores on those tests mean in terms of school. We've found, and other groups have found the same thing with similar tests, that emotional intelligence predicts scholastic performance, not just IQ, but CI as well. And emotional intelligence predicts absenteeism from school. Emotional intelligence predicts, well-being in school. We found with some of our research that bullies and even victims of bullies had low emotional intelligence. So, we published some of that work. And so after probably about 4 or 5 years of publishing papers and about what emotional intelligence predicts in schools, a lot of those schools said, well, what about the next step? And the next step was, how do we then develop emotional intelligence? And so really over the last few years, we've been on this sort of journey now to develop tailor-made emotional intelligence programs for different year levels. But, really that's sort of the exciting phase we're at the moment, and just trying to work with schools who are interested in emotional intelligence.
How do most people's assessment of their own emotional intelligence skills stack up with what they would actually find should they take one of these tests?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally, they're relatively spot on, to be honest. So the questions are such that we ask you to rate how often you show certain behaviors. So we don't really ask you to say, well, are you a good person, or do a lot of people like you, or things like this. So it's very much emotional intelligence sort of bundled into your day-to-day workplace behaviors. And generally where things are going okay, then there's a pretty good concordance between how you see yourself and how other people in the workplace see you. But it's not always the case. Where there are toxic workplaces and difficult organizations and places where people are not getting on and so on, often you see quite a big discordance between the self-report and the peer report. Sometimes you also see people can be more modest actually as well. Sometimes people rate themselves lower than other people sort of see their behaviors.
If one were to apply some of these same emotional intelligence principles that you've been looking at primarily with organizations and take them into more of a personal context, dealing with family, dealing with romantic relationships, would there be much of a difference? I mean, do these things still apply in the same way?
I think because they're sort of fundamental skills, they're not that different in terms of the workplace and home life and other places. But nevertheless, sometimes there are some differences. There are some environments that don't allow you to express emotion, or that erode your ability to manage your emotions, and you have an increase in stress and things like this. So, every environment is different, and I guess the GNOS measures, we've tried to focus on the workplace as much as possible, but I think really emotional intelligence are a series of competencies that relate to all aspects of life and functioning.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Professor Stough for taking the time for that exploration of emotional intelligence. As he mentioned, he and his colleagues are now working quite a bit with schools and universities around some of these ideas in measuring and training people in emotional intelligences. So if you happen to be a school administrator type and want to get put in touch, feel free to reach out to me, Jesse at smartdrugsmarts.com, and I'll get you connected. You can also quite easily Google Stough at Swinburne University. He does not make himself hard to reach, and we'll also have a link on the smartdrugsmarts.com website where you can find him. I must admit that during that conversation, I kept thinking that my own intuitive definition of intelligence seems like it should be a little bit more fixed than the types of things that we were talking about as emotional intelligences. I felt like every single one of those markers is to a large extent a learned social skill that we start out with as absolute zeros when we're born, and then we pick up over the course of our lifetimes from parents and teachers and siblings and friends and stuff like that. Whereas the cognitive intelligences, although they're certainly helped along the way by training and socialization and knowledge passed on, it seems like a certain amount of cognitive intelligence would exist even in the absence of training. You could give a baby some Legos and some blocks, and they're going to teach themselves some stuff about gravity and how shapes fit together without any sort of social interaction. Whereas with the emotional intelligences, that doesn't seem to be the case. But I haven't thought this through all the way. Anyway, to find out more about your own emotional intelligence, let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So perhaps not surprisingly, while we were putting together this episode at the Smart Drug Smarts offices, and I use the term loosely because we're actually spread out all over the world, but we started passing around between us this link to an emotional intelligence test. This isn't a full spectrum emotional intelligence test, but more about how well a person can read other people's emotions. Really only takes a couple of minutes to do. It was pretty interesting. I got a 16 out of 20 on it. I was 10 for 10 going in, but I lost it. I crumbled under pressure at the end. Anushtup, our editor, got a 17 out of 20, so I must admit I'm a bit jealous. But it's a pretty fun little test. You see a bunch of people, they're making different expressions, different poses, and you are supposed to read their emotions. You've got 4 choices, multiple choice. It seems like it would be really easy, and some of them are. But then when you get one wrong, you're just like, oh gosh, it was so close, and you start re-looking at the person's face. Did I actually see that emotion in there? But we'll put up the link to this test on Smart Drug smartdrugsmarts.com. I would tell you right now, it's just a little too much typing involved for me to do it letter by letter over the podcast. But if you go to smartdrugsmarts.com/emotional-intelligence, that'll get you to this episode, and we will have the link on that page.
Smart Drug Smarts. We get you thinking.
Okay, that is the entire episode. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you're feeling all emotionally inspired after hearing that episode about emotional intelligence and you just can't wait to reach out to somebody and tell them about Smart Drug Smarts, well, then we encourage you to do exactly that. You can tell them that next week's episode will very likely be an experimental episode. We've got a couple of experiments coming up. We've also got that Adderall episode coming up where we're going to be talking with real-world Adderall users about their experiences with that drug. I will keep you in suspense because I don't really exactly know myself yet, but tune in next week and we'll all find out together. In the meantime, don't be a stranger over at smartdrugsmarts.com, where we will have the links to everything that I talked about here. I'll be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.